Space Cowboy Books presents Simultaneous Times, a science and speculative fiction podcast. Short stories to stir the imagination by contemporary authors.
The Fun They Hadn't by James Machell, with music by TSG, read by Jean-Paul Garnier. Another day of constant summer, but no children played outside. The lake drew birds with its shine, but no one cast their rods. And the roads were eerily silent, holding their breath for an ice cream truck whose music tingled only the imagination. "Can we go to the park, Mom?" "No, Georgia," she replied, drinking hot tea like it was poison. "But why?" She turned suddenly, looming from the chair at the kitchen table, and her eyes appeared to cast a shadow. "Maybe I should just let one of them be your parents." Georgia actually didn't mind this idea, but stomped upstairs nonetheless and found her brother flying his kite at the window. 1,000 years ago, it might have fallen down like an autumn leaf. Now, the wind raced to carry the red sail as far as the string would allow, gradually doing so as to avoid burning the hands of young George. "You shouldn't be flying that, you know. Mom's gonna see." "But they gave it to me," snapped George. "I don't get things from her." Georgia gazed outside. Their mother may have given birth to them, but they supplied their food, their toys, their music, even their beds. Dad told her that all these things were here before they came. She glared at his head, appearing over the top of the hill facing their house, followed by his torso and legs. He was carrying a big black umbrella. "You're in trouble now," she told George. They pulled the kite in together, the wind having dropped to avoid a tug of war, and George ran to hide it while she listened for how much trouble he was in. "I've got water running down my sleeves," cried Dad, flinging the door open so forcefully that it struck the wall. He always announced himself this way because repairing the crack was just another job for them to do while his family slept. "You were right to wear your overcoat," cried Mom. "But the sweater?" "I was trying to make a point," he yelled as to be heard upstairs. "Which would be a lot easier to do if my own children wouldn't fly kites rather than honor their parents." Georgia, get down here now." The children descended with their heads lowered, each holding a corner of the kite their father would insist on burning. Georgia expected to be punished as well, because it was her job to make sure George didn't play with any of the toys in his room. "We're sorry, Mom," she said preemptively. Dad was splashing cold water on his face. He searched for a towel, but one materialized in his hand. It took a moment for him to decide upon being insulted, and he threw it in the trash without drying. Georgia could already sense a particularly hot surge of anger on the way to his throat, and she braced herself for the spittle when he yelled. The television saved them by turning itself on. It was in the next room, but the entire home was overwhelmed by orchestral music. The rising violins, pounding drums, and choral chant all seemed to announce triumph. It maintained its crescendo long enough for Dad to forget what he was angry about, and then diminished into an upbeat score. "Hi there," said a chirpy voice, neither male nor female, but strangely familiar, as if everybody heard it before they were born. We're just here to remind you that the only summers that last forever are the ones in your memories. Georgia wanted to see who was speaking, but knew her parents would consider it a second betrayal. They wouldn't even let her watch cartoons in case one of them appeared on the screen with declarations of love for all terrestrial life. There's a winter on its way to you now, and with it comes sickness, not joy. Rot, hunger, cockroaches, wolves, frogs, scorpions, and regret. Mom and Dad looked at each other in panic while Georgia and George shared a glance of subdued excitement. Winter lasted only a week, but they spent it building snowmen with no fear of being stung because the plagues reserved themselves for adults. We hate to see you suffer, and it pains us a great deal more when it's at our own hands. But sometimes the dark is needed to see the light. Everything we do is out of love, and we hope you understand this before a single tear has turned into ice. The television turned itself off. A banquet of pancakes and syrup appeared on the table, and daffodils grew out of an empty vase. George instinctively grabbed a fork, but was stopped by a pair of hard stares before he managed to pull his chair out. "Go back to your rooms," ordered Mom. "We need to discuss this." There was a book waiting for them on George's bed. It was called A Better Sky. George held a finger up to his lips because Georgia had been sworn to secrecy when the last one appeared in his backpack. Dad buried it in under kitchen waste, and George had been waiting ever since for another one to arrive so he could hide it better. He leafed through with a smile. There were no words inside, only pictures. But it provided the closest thing to an explanation of their world. The initial pages showed men wearing green with metal sticks that spat fire. People were bleeding even though the flames were far away, and there was no one in the sky to help them feel better. The next ones had pictures of people in cages. There were grandmothers in their white beds with needles in their arms. There were half-naked families whose ribs were showing, and they slept on the side of the road while big cars were driving past them. George's smile grew wider as a woman with the wings of a white bird came down to carry some of these people away in their arms. They didn't help the ones in their cars, and the men with the fiery sticks were all chopped in half with giant swords. The next pages showed an almost empty world. Bad people had children with each other, and the houses became full again. The only difference was that they had everything they could ever want, so there was no reason to hurt each other. Mom had given them a long talk after Dad found the last one during his daily inspection of their bags. She said a long time ago, machines came down from the sky, and in those machines were little people with gray faces. They didn't have wings or massive swords, and they certainly didn't look like women. They were ugly little creatures with black eyes in their bulbous heads, and 3 claws on each of their 4 hands. "Did you see them?" asked Georgia at the time. "No," sighed Mom, seeming ashamed of her desire. "But your great-great-great and so on grandmother did. She was just one of the people minding her own business when the clouds filled with color and claws fell from them like ones at the arcade. They took the people they wanted, probably to eat or something equally horrid, and left your poor grandmother here with nothing to do. She taught her children, just as we teach ours, to ignore them until they get bored and go back to their own planet." Georgia saw no reason to believe anything she said. Words meant nothing without substantiation by acts. Their parents probably couldn't stand being told what to do because they wanted to be in charge of themselves as well as their children. This was almost the case. Mom and Dad sat silently in the kitchen, thinking loud enough to hear each other's thoughts. It was a few days before Georgia's birthday, but her presents had already appeared at the end of her bed in orange wrapping paper with a generic note. They would have liked to choose their own gifts, but there weren't any shops, or to find jobs, or at least have some way, other than words, of showing their love. Ephemera by Tonya R. Moore, with music by Fog Machine, read by Jenna Hanchey.
Get your head out of your ass boots. Bowman yelled back at the youngster sleeping at the back of his wagon. Time to earn your keep. Boots jerked awake to a smattering of guffaws and low chuckles. She grinned back at the other gravediggers riding in the wagon. Wiping drool from the corner of her mouth, the dark, pixie-like young woman straightened and croaked, "Mornin', boss." She undid her harness and pulled a faded red scarf from the pocket of her cargo pants. With swift motions, she used the scarf to tie back her thick red and blue braids. She scrambled down the aisle until she was crouching behind the pilot's seat. "We there yet?" she asked. "Nearly," Bowman grunted. He was the outfit's boss, a sturdy and barely civilized sort, with freckles and a bushy beard. Half a cigar hung, unlit, from the corner of his mouth. Boots looked up to Bowman. He was rough, but shrewd, and a gruff kindness lurked beneath the man's mean exterior. Boots had caught up with Bowman's diggers in the capital. Desperate to escape the tedium of logistics division, she'd begged to join his crew. Bowman initially refused, but after much haranguing, he'd relented and let her join up on a trial basis. Daylight broke. The horizon split wide open. Burns' twin moons, Jaguar and Snow, loomed over the town as if beckoning the wagon-weary diggers into their watchful embrace. The wagon, a caterpillar-shaped contraption, trundled into the heart of the derelict town. A trio of dactyls circled above the wagon. Boots was unnerved by their deep-throated bellows. Large enough to snatch a grown man off the ground, the big vultures were harmless. Still, it was as if they knew something the gravediggers didn't. The way they circled over the wagon, as if waiting for something to die. Boots found it unnerving, and wished they would go circle over something else, somewhere else. Bowman shut the engine down and descended from the wagon. All the other diggers grabbed their gear and followed suit. Boots hurried back to her seat and snatched her pack from the overhead compartment. By the time she got outside, Bowman had already begun briefing the group. "We need to find the hospital first. That's where most of the bodies will be." He set a small cube down on the ground. A holographic three-dimensional map appeared. "This town should follow the standard template." His finger jabbed at 3 different spots on the map. "Burial grounds here, here, and here." Sol, a stout Rasta man, stepped forward. He hooked his thumbs into his waistband, drew in a deep breath, and picked up where Bowman had left off. "All right, Team 1, take Sector 1. Team 2 and 3, cover the hospital. Rookies." His head inclined toward Boots and a gangly youth named Terry. You two stick with the boss man and take Sector 4. There was a pause. What are y'all waiting for? An invitation? Bowman demanded. Everyone except for Boots and Terry took that as their cue to skedaddle. Come on, you two, the boss man instructed. I'll walk you through deploying the mini drones. We need to get the safety net set up before we get to digging. Bowman went back to the wagon and came back with a handful of small spherical objects. These, he said, are set to work in tandem with each other. They send out a signal that'll keep the bigger critters away. Switch them on, let them fly. Simple enough, right? Mini drones deployed. Boots and Terry followed Bowman northward in silence. They passed a saloon, vines growing wild over the walls and the latticed double doors. Boots wondered if there were any bodies inside. They rounded the corner at the blacksmith's shop. A huge, rusted wagon wheel with a bent spoke had been left leaning against the ramshackle shack. Boots couldn't tell which was holding up which. Y'all ready for this? Bowman challenged. Boots and Terry nodded. Inoculation's up to date, he asked. Yep, said Boots. Yeah, boss, said Terry. Good. The boss man nodded. Boots, you take the houses up ahead. Terry, take the ones on the right. I got the ones on the left. Gotcha, boss. Boots slung her pack over her shoulder, grip tightening on her shovel. Watch out for critters, especially those burn wolverines, Bowman cautioned as the trio parted. Just 'cause we're inside the safety net don't mean there ain't nothing that'll try to get ya. Near noon, Boots found her first corpse. A woman had died at her table, inside a quaint wooden house. It was as if she'd been sitting there at the table, waiting for someone when she died. Her head was down on the table. Strung between her fingers was a necklace with a locket. She wore a silken dress, once white, but now brown from time and layers of dust. The woman was nothing but bones now, but the corpse still managed to look dainty and dignified. Weren't the first settlers supposed to be of sterner stuff? Boots wondered. Not that she, a dark little runt, had much room to criticize. She tugged her gloves on and got to work. Boots worked with an efficiency that came from months of practice, under the tutelage of Bowman and Soul. First, she set her backpack down and removed a silicone body bag. She cut off a sample of the woman's hair for the DNA records. Then she carefully set about bagging and tagging the corpse. Boots would need to wait for the carrier to come around, to take the body to one of the designated burial grounds. She radioed Bowman. "Boss, I got one." "Bagged and tagged?" came the terse query. "Yup," she answered, heading outside for a breather. "All right, stay there. I'll send a carrier round." "Will do." Boots stepped outside, closing the front door behind her. If you thought about it, grave digging was a terrible business. Like dactyls, the grave diggers descended upon desolate colonies to rob the dead and bury their bones. The young woman's lips curved into a wry smile. To have sought such a vocation must make her seem a twisted sort. There came a distant rumble. It became louder and closer by the second. The young woman whirled. Galloping towards Boots was a massive horse. Images flashed into Boots' awareness. The rider's leathery face, his wide-brimmed hat and spurs. They were coming right at her so fast. Boots froze. She wanted to run, but couldn't. Her damned legs just wouldn't work. The horse reared up. She heard the rider's gravelly voice sound out, "Whoa, girl, whoa!" Boots screamed and cowered as those mighty hooves came bearing down. With a loud poof, horse and rider disappeared, and a murder of crow-like critters surrounded her. They swooped this way and that in a flurry of mad cawing and flapping of scaly wings. She flailed and yelped amidst the melee. "What the?" Boots stood there trembling after they'd taken to the skies. Holy shit. Knees turned to jelly. She sank to the ground. What was that? What just happened? There were black scales scattered on the ground. She hadn't imagined it, but what could explain it? "Boots?" Terry's voice crackled in her earpiece. Several houses away, he'd heard her scream. "Boots, what's wrong?" Nothing," she stammered, still shaken. "It was nothing." Late in the evening, the diggers camped out in the middle of the desolate town. The rookies cooked. Boots didn't mind. With the bounty she had found on the vegetable patch gone wild, they would all be eating like kings and queens. She and Terry served up dinner, and the conversation turned to things the grave diggers had seen and heard on their expeditions. The talk turned to eerie sightings and inexplicable experiences. Boots hesitated before joining in. "I saw something today," she ventured. Everyone was all ears. There was a man on a horse. "They nearly ran me down, but then," she said, "they turned into bird things and flew away." "For real?" Soul demanded, aghast. "Yeah," Boots said. He frowned. "You're just messing around, aren't you?" Nervous laughter scattered all around. "You don't have to believe me," Boots huffed, "but I know what I saw." "I believe you," Soul answered, sobering. A few other men and women grunted in agreement. "There are ghosts on Burn," Soul said, looking her square in the eyes. The dark of his eyes glittered in the firelight. "I'm not talking about the stupid stories we used to tell when we were kids on the ships. I mean real ghosts." "What do you mean?" Terry asked. "Well," Soul leaned forward. "When we were kids growing up on the ship, Bowman and I used to crawl into the air ducts to eavesdrop on the adults. One transmission from the first expedition said there was intelligent life on Burn." "You mean aliens?" Terry managed, through a mouthful of grub. "This is their planet, so I wouldn't call them that." Bernard Graves, a skinny man who was usually less than talkative, commented. "They're natives. We're the aliens." "If there are natives, how come we haven't met them?" Terry demanded. Boots nodded in concert with him, wanting to know too. "That's the thing," Soul answered. "They're ghosts. They're like will-o-wisps and change shape like the wind. Firebirds, the older folks called them." "Why firebird?" Boots wanted to know. Story goes, some of the first colonists actually saw one change its shape. It changed from moss that grew on a dead horse's body into the shape of a bird. You know how in the old stories, the phoenix... "Nothing but hogwash," Bowman grumbled. "Soul, stop filling these kids' ears with that nonsense." "Right," Soul grinned. You never did believe in any of that stuff, did you? Boots ate the rest of her meal in silence. Had she encountered a firebird earlier in the day? It was hard to say. The next morning, as Boots made her rounds, she spotted a trail that led far afield and up the side of the mountain. She thought about the bodies that might be there, forgotten and waiting to be found. How awful would it be if the gravediggers moved on without finding them? How damned sad would that be? She considered radioing Bowman, but figured, forget it. He'd only yell at her and order her not to leave the safety net. She could go check and be back within minutes. If she did find something, Bowman would have no choice but to consider it a job well done. If she found nothing, no one would need to know that she'd left the safety net. She stepped outside of the safety net's perimeter and made a mad dash for the distant slope. At first, there was nothing but scrub along the dusty slope, but up ahead was a huddle of thick-trunked trees. As she neared the thicket of trees, Boots rounded a corner and came face to face with a nightmare. A monstrous beast with horns protruding from its mouth leaped past her. It skated to a stop and turned toward her, long, spiky tail writhing and twisting in the air. The creature pawed the ground and snorted. Its head reared up. The beast let loose a deafening bellow. A small whimper squeaked out of Boots. Terror took hold. She turned and fled. She ran for the cover of the trees, scrambling upslope as fast as her legs would take her. The beast gave chase, hooves thunderous against the ground. Boots ran until her lungs were straining, the muscles in her legs burning. She heard the frenzied growls of the beast behind her and gagged on the putrid stench of its breath. She ran, this way and that, up the side of the hill. She ran for her life. She ran until she couldn't hear the beast behind her anymore. Just when Boots thought that she'd put some distance between them, the very earth beneath her feet gave way. She screamed as she fell into a cavity in the side of the mountain. She hit the ground hard. She blacked out. Time ticked on. When the young gravedigger finally came to, it was dark. Every inch of her body screamed pain. She tasted blood, blossoming sweet metallic inside her tongue. Boots forced her bruised body upright and gingerly slipped off her backpack. She fumbled around inside for a light and managed to get to her feet. The pain from her fall was subsiding, and thankfully, there wasn't anything broken. She held the light up and surveyed the silent space. Someone, it seemed, had started building a mine shaft. They'd gotten off to a good start with this area, but seemed to have stopped dead in their tracks. Puzzling over this, Boots made her way past some dust-laden machinery. She had yet to spot a way out, and her gut was starting to fill with dread. The gravedigger looked up to the hole she'd fallen through. "Long way up," she murmured, worrying at her bottom lip with her teeth. Boots tried to raise someone on the comms, but there was no response. Had she damaged her unit in the fall? Or was she too far out of range? Either way, she was going to have to find her own way out of this mess. Boots took another step and stumbled, tripping over something. She shone her light downward. When she saw what was on the ground, her blood went cold. The corpse was half mummified, half skeletonized, and enveloped by some weird iridescent moss. Disgust warred with fascination. Fascination turned to bewilderment. Bewilderment turned to horror as Boots took note of the dead body's features. She scrambled away, knelt there shaking. She recognized that half-rotted scarf, tying back those thick locks of hair. She recognized the threadbare remains of that shirt and those cargo pants. She knew those nearly new boots. This wasn't just any corpse. She knelt there, trembling, her entire universe come crashing down. "There are ghosts on burn," Soul had said. As Boots knelt there, Soul's words echoing in her mind, her whole body became suffused with light. The burning body changed, taking on the shape of a creature with wings. Casting the dead woman's memories aside, the newborn firebird took flight.
In this episode of Simultaneous Times, you heard The Fun They Hadn't by James Machell, with music by TSG, and Ephemera by Tonya R. Moore, with music by Fog Machine. Theme music by Dane Luscombe. Be sure to visit us at our bookstore in Joshua Tree, California, or visit us online at spacecowboybooks.com.